Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Raimundo Rios Mayo Library in Arkansas. Good evening and welcome back to the show. Tonight we're going to be discussing John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was the 35th President of the United States, and as a lot of people already know, he was assassinated in Dallas. Tonight's show, Strange Things, July 9th, 2016, Season 1, Episode number 11. What do we know about the John F. Kennedy assassination? Well, he was 46 years old when he was shot and died in Dallas. He was the 35th President of the United States, and the big question a lot of people want to know is, who would want to kill our president? A better question would be, who didn't want to kill the president? He had a list of people, very long, very sordid. It's just a matter of trying to figure out who on the list actually got the trigger pulled. A lot of people said it was the mafia. The mafia did it because, well, they had given Kennedy a lot of money to get him elected president, and then he turned around and he started going after the mafia, him and his brother, trying to put everybody in prison. Well, actually, the mafia had given a whole lot of money to Richard Nixon, who ran against Kennedy. In fact, the mafia is supposed to have given Richard Nixon somewhere in the neighborhood of over $1 million in cash, which was funneled over to Richard Nixon through a friend of his named Bebe Rebozo, who was known as the Bag Man. Another possible suspect would be Russia. Perhaps the Russians wanted to kill Kennedy. Could it have been our own military? Maybe the CIA? Or, as they would like us to believe, one lone gunman. Other people that come up on the list could be Dulles, rich oilmen in Texas, and then there's the possibility of Johnson, Nixon, and Bush, all who became presidents after Kennedy. All three were in Dallas either the day before or the actual day of the killing. A rather strange thing about Bush, senior, not junior, I was 5 years old when Kennedy was shot. I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing because it left an impression. My mother broke out in tears. The people on the TV went nuts talking about Kennedy dying. It was an emotional day. And even though I was only 5 years old at the time, I remember sitting on the floor staring at the TV wondering, is that any way to treat somebody? George Bush Sr. said he can't remember where he was when Kennedy was shot. That's just a little odd. Or maybe it's Alzheimer's kicking in. Who knows? Some folks will tell you that it was Cuba. Cuba did it because of the Bay of Pigs. Yes, Kennedy took full responsibility for the screw-up at the Bay of Pigs, but he really wasn't responsible for it. He simply took responsibility because he was the president, he was the man in charge, and therefore he felt that it was his place to do so. It could also have been the Cuban Missile Crisis. After all, the United States did kind of treat Cuba bad there for a couple of weeks. Then there were the several failed attempts on Castro's life. It began with Eisenhower. When Eisenhower was the president of the United States, a lot of people don't realize that Richard Nixon was the vice president. One of the jobs that was slated for the vice president at that time was to do something about Castro. Now, I don't know that Eisenhower actually said, kill that man, but he did tell Richard Nixon to do something about him. So Nixon began a long and varied attempt at taking out Castro. I can't tell you exactly how many different attempts were made on the man's life, but there were many. Castro said later that he'd actually liked Kennedy. He considered him a fair man, and Castro also said he didn't much care for Johnson at all. So if Castro had been responsible for killing Kennedy, he would have been setting himself up for far worse treatment at the hands of Johnson. Castro has pretty much emphatically denied that his country or his military had anything to do with Kennedy dying. Then there's Russia. Russia wasn't really interested in killing Kennedy. Khrushchev has said that he really liked Kennedy. Nina Khrushchev, the granddaughter of the former Soviet premier, said he actually had a great affinity for President Kennedy. The Cuban Missile Crisis only showed Russia he was strong but fair. There was also the little thing about the joint mission that Kennedy was talking about, where Russia and the United States would come together and work to accomplish the first moon mission as a joint effort. Kennedy had already started the process by telling NASA to forward any and all information they had to Russia to get the ball rolling. Khrushchev has also mentioned that he didn't much care for Johnson either. So why would Russia take out a man that they could get along with, a man that they trusted and respected, a man that was working to bring the two countries together? Why would they eliminate him from the picture only to suddenly have to deal with Johnson as the head of the free world? People in Russia didn't much trust Johnson, one way or another. Another possibility that people will bring up are military. Now, we're not talking the soldiers in the field. We're not talking the men who have sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States. We're talking about those shadowy people that lurk in the background. The people that every time a war is declared somewhere, every time shots are fired, somehow their bank account suddenly seems to swell to unimaginable proportions. During the Vietnam War, the United States had been sending what they called advisors into Vietnam to help the South fight the North. Kennedy came out and said, in the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones who have to win it or lose it. He'd said all this on a CBS interview. Kennedy was planning to pull as many troops out of Vietnam as was feasible at the time. The military-industrial complex, these are the people that Eisenhower had warned our country about at the end of his presidency. These are the men that become enormously rich every time the United States goes to war with someone. All those bombs and all those bullets and all those jets and tanks, those things are not created by the United States military. They're manufactured by private businesses. These private businesses don't exactly give them to the military. They sell them at an enormous profit. These are the members of the military that could possibly have wanted Kennedy dead, because if he stopped the conflict in Vietnam, it would drastically affect their bottom line. The military doesn't really make anything but soldiers and bad food. We're going to break for a few commercials. We'll be right back in just a few. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you desiring a cup of coffee? You want something that doesn't come in a styrofoam cup made exactly like everybody else's coffee? Swing on by the Organic Man Coffee Shop, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. They have the best coffee on the planet. If you're not into coffee, they also have tea, they have fruit drinks, they have various other things that you may find to your liking. Stop on by the Organic Man Coffee Shop, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. The best coffee on the planet.
We gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanasa Radio.
I promise you this.
Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanasa Radio.
Every day in a letter, sealed with a kiss.
You're listening to Arcanasa Radio. Welcome back to the show. We just got through going over various aspects of why the military could have been suspected of having something to do with Kennedy's death. And like I said, we're not talking the soldiers in the field. We're talking a very small group of shadowy conspirators that lurk in the background. Another possibility that's been put forth is the CIA. They received a very bad black eye from the Bay of Pigs. In fact, things went so bad that Allen Dulles was fired by Kennedy. Dulles was the head of the CIA at the time. Kennedy was upset with the man, possibly because he'd been lied to. Allen Dulles had put forth the idea that when the soldiers, the Cuban soldiers that were trained by the United States military, when they landed in Cuba, that the people of Cuba were going to rise up and help them overthrow Castro. Dulles had given Kennedy all kinds of stories like this, to a point that Kennedy actually thought that perhaps this would happen. Instead, when the soldiers went in at the Bay of Pigs, many civilians in Cuba had risen up to fight them, not to welcome them as liberators. Dulles had pretty much misled Kennedy as to how the Bay of Pigs invasion would go. Kennedy also threatened to break up the CIA. He had said that he was going to scatter them to the corners of the earth. He was going to see to it that the CIA no longer existed. He was going to allow naval intelligence to do their job. Kennedy, after all, had been in the Navy, and he had a warm spot in his heart for them. So he'd much rather see the Navy take over the job that the CIA had been doing. John Foster Dulles, Allen's brother, was the Secretary of State. He would depict various foreign governments as being hostile to America, when in reality they were hostile to the CIA. But John Foster Dulles would tell the president that Brazil or Venezuela or one of these other countries was just on the verge of going communist, and therefore we must do something to stop that. In other words, he was feeding the president a lot of lies. Allen Dulles, on the other hand, would work on covertly engineered ways of overthrowing various governments in South and Central America. He would claim it was for the good of the United States. A lot of what was going on was actually for the good of the CIA. For example, the American Fruit Company, the International Fruit Company, they imported bananas to the United States. Sounds like a good, healthy idea. It was actually a front for the CIA. They were making millions of dollars bringing bananas from South America to the United States. when Brazil decided that they wanted to nationalize their fruit crop because all that money was not doing them any good, suddenly Brazil was considered to be a rogue nation and something had to be done about it. The CIA was more concerned with their own well-being than that of the United States. Now, I'm not saying the entire CIA, simply certain shadowy individuals that lurk in the background, people that make bad decisions that we're still paying for today. Allen Dulles also brought thousands of Nazi war criminals to the United States during Operation Paperclip, even though Truman had said that no Nazi war criminal would come to the United States regardless. Dulles had everyone's files revamped so that it would show that all of these scientists were actually just nice, honest, thinking men with no criminal affiliation whatsoever. There was a CIA official named William Harvey, who was the head of the CIA mafia plot against Castro. He absolutely hated John Kennedy, and he didn't much care for Bobby Kennedy either. He considered them both to be weak when it came to dealing with the communists. William Harvey was seen flying to Dallas by his own deputy early in November of 1963. The rumor is that perhaps he had something to do with the Kennedy assassination. Then there's the one lone gunman. This is the theory that a lot of people really hope and pray and wish was true. The reason they hope and wish and pray that this was the truth, if it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald that killed Kennedy, then who did it? Whoever the person was, they got away with it. Because once Lee Harvey Oswald was dead, that was pretty much the end of the investigation. Sure, there was the Warren Commission. They pretended to look into the assassination, but they were more of a let's make people happy than let's actually find out what's going on. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, October 18th, 1939. After joining the Marine Corps in 1956, Oswald was trained in radar operations and received a secret clearance. He was later stationed in Atsugi Naval Air Facility in Japan. Atsugi was a well-known CIA operation. In 1955, Oswald was in the same Louisiana Civil Air Patrol with the most notorious CIA pilot of all times. His commander was named David Ferrie, a frequent CIA operative who often worked for New Orleans crime boss Carlo Marcello. If you saw the movie JFK, the one by Oliver Stone, the character of David Ferrie was played by Joe Pesci. And having seen the movie and knowing a lot about David Ferrie, I would say he came pretty close to the mark. David Ferrie had this bizarre condition that caused him to lose all of his hair, and so he had made his own wig out of monkey hair, and then he would paint his eyebrows on. He was unstable, to say the least, but it didn't mean he couldn't fly an airplane and do various odd jobs for the CIA. Ferrie is also believed to be the pilot who flew Marcello back into the country after he had been deported by Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Kennedy had had Marcello deported as a way of showing the mafia who was boss and to see if they could figure out exactly how this guy was going to get back into the country. They didn't learn a whole lot from the whole endeavor, but it did really upset the mafia as far as the Kennedys were concerned. Ferrie was in court with Marcello when Marcello was acquitted of charges brought by the Attorney General Robert Kennedy in 1963. Ferrie also provided logistical support in a covert government operation in which cancer researcher Dr. Mary Sherman was murdered in 1964. Elements of the CIA had decided that the best way to kill Castro would be to give him cancer. They were working on weaponizing the cancer cells to see if they could possibly somehow inject Castro with this magic cocktail that would lead to his downfall. The doctor, Mary Sherman, was killed in what could possibly be called a very bizarre accident, or possibly she was murdered. She was hit with a bolt of electricity from a dynamo at a lab where they were doing various experiments. It practically blew her in half. However, the scientists working there at Tulane did not call the authorities to say one of our lab doctors has been killed. Instead, they packed up her body. They hauled it back to her apartment. They placed her in the bed as if she was asleep, and then they set the bed on fire, trying to make it look as if she had died in bed, possibly murdered by some burglar who had broken into her apartment. The amount of damage done to her far surpassed anything that the fire could have done. If you find this an interesting subject and would like to know more about it, there's a book called Dr. Mary's Monkey by Edward T. Haslam. Fantastic story. It's available on Amazon.com. I found it one of those kind of books that you just didn't want to put down. Getting back to Oswald, he became the only American to defect to Russia in 1959. Once he was in Russia, that's where he met his wife, Marina. And surprisingly, Marina thought that he was a native Russian, the way he spoke, even though he had taught himself how to speak Russian. Oswald claims that it was his intelligence that he had given to the Russians that he allowed Gary Powers to be shot down in his U-2. After all, Oswald had been working with the U-2 as a radar operator when he was in Japan. The intel that Oswald gave the Russians, apparently, from what I've read, had already been found by the Russians. Oswald was simply giving him the information to make himself look better. Now, how in the world did Oswald manage to get back into the United States in 1962, considering that he would be considered a traitor? At that time, there was only one man in the entire planet that could have helped Oswald get back into the country. And who was that one man? The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy saw fit to not only bring Oswald to the United States, but to bring Marina, his wife, as well, and their daughter, and the United States government paid their transportation, put them up in a hotel, and then saw to it that they got back to New Orleans okay. All of this for a man that's supposed to have been a traitor to the United States. Once returning to the United States, Oswald somehow managed to land a job working at a place called Jaggers, Childs, and Stovall. Now, what's odd about this? The simple fact that this company did highly classified work for the government. It included creating detailed maps of Cuba. Oswald once told a friend that the CIA had arranged for him to get that job at the map-making facility. A man who befriended Oswald and helped him get established in Dallas was George de Mohrenschildt. That is a hard name to pronounce. De Mohrenschildt was a CIA operative. Surprisingly, when de Mohrenschildt was called to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1976, he died the day before from a gunshot. It was supposed to look like a suicide, but it didn't look that much like a suicide. However, it looked enough that people said, He just didn't want to testify before the House Select Committee, so he killed himself. He had actually been positive about testifying. Mark Lane and other authors reported that his personal telephone book was located after his death and found to contain the entry Bush, George H.W., in parentheses, Poppy, 1412 West Ohio, and it also said Zapata Petroleum Midland. This would be the Bush's oil company. Now, why would Des Moines Shield have this entry in his phone book? Nobody is alive today that can tell us. However, if you would like to read more on this subject, Mark Lane's book, The Last Word, is also available from Amazon.com. Lee Harvey Oswald was seen in the lunchroom of the book depository by Officer Marion Baker shortly after Kennedy was shot. So much shortly, the officer had just barely enough time to jump off his motorcycle and run inside when he saw Oswald sitting in the lunchroom. He asked the supervisor, who was that man, and the supervisor identified him as one of the workers. Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have shot Officer Tippit. Why shoot J.D. Tippit? 4 witnesses at the Dobbs House restaurant in Dallas recalled that J.B. Tippit and Lee Harvey Oswald had had breakfast together on numerous occasions. Officer Tippit was also an acquaintance of Jack Ruby. They would have lunch together, and Officer Tippit was often seen hanging out at several of the nightclubs that Jack Ruby owned. So why would Tippit have been shot? The theory goes that Oswald's walking down the street. Officer Tippit sees him, begins questioning him as to possibly being a subject for killing Kennedy. Oswald, thinking that he had been caught by the law, decides to shoot it out, gets the drop on Officer Tippit, and shoots him 4 times with a semi-automatic pistol. They know it's a semi-automatic pistol because the shell cases were laying on the ground at Officer Tippit's crime scene. However, when Lee Harvey Oswald was later apprehended, he was carrying a revolver. Revolvers don't normally spit their empty shell cases out on the ground. One theory goes that Officer Tippit, who knew Oswald and knew Jack Ruby, had actually been sent to silence Oswald, track him down, take him out, and then just simply pretend like he had resisted arrest. Perhaps Oswald got the drop on Tippit before Tippit could get his pistol out of the holster. However, several witnesses at the scene had said there were 2 men at the shooting, not just one. Jack Ruby said, "Isn't it strange that Oswald, who hasn't worked a lick most of his life, should be fortunate enough to get a job at the book building 2 weeks before the president himself knew that he was going to Dallas? Now, where would a jerk like Oswald get the information that the president was coming to Dallas?" Stand by for a few minutes. We will break for station identification and a few brief commercials. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you looking for a good cup of coffee? Stop on by the Organic Man Coffee Shop, 1002 Iturbide, suite number 7. They have the best coffee on the planet. Not a coffee drinker? They also have tea. They have sweet drinks. Swing on by 1002 Iturbide, suite number 7. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
Though we gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanelza Radio.
I promise you this. I'll
Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanelza Radio.
every day in a letter sealed with a kiss.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. As if that wasn't enough, Oswald had also been seen with Ruby by witnesses on several occasions. Ruby's sister Eva Grant confirmed that Tippett and Oswald were both common people at several of the Vegas nightclubs that that Ruby owned. Oswald and Ruby were seen together in New Orleans as well on several occasions. Officer Tippett was shot about 6 blocks from an apartment building that Ruby owned. Witnesses who saw the two men at the scene of the crime were never called by the Warren Commission. When Oswald entered the theater, shortly after, the police received a phone call claiming that a man had just run in to the theater without paying. However, the story I heard was that Oswald went to the window, purchased a ticket from a young lady, and then went inside to watch the movie. The man who called, claiming that some suspicious character had just run into the theater, no one could find him at the theater after the fact. It's almost as if Oswald was being set up by someone. Now, why would he go to a theater in the middle of the afternoon, shortly after President Kennedy had been shot? The CIA was known for having meets at theaters. People are coming and going from the theater all the time. It's dark in there. They tell you, sit in the middle row, such and such a location, and then someone may walk in and sit down next to you, exchange a package, tell you something, and then leave. Very few people really pay a whole lot of attention to the comings and goings at a theater. So one of the theories is that Oswald, who was associated with the CIA, went to the theater on orders from his handler, hoping to receive some kind of story, indication, information on what was going on with Kennedy. Oswald was interrogated for 12 hours after the Kennedy assassination. No one bothered to write down anything that was said. He was interrogated by the Dallas police. He was interrogated by the FBI. Even the Secret Service came by and asked him several questions. Yet no one saw fit to grab a piece of paper and write anything down. This doesn't sound like good police work to me. Sounds sloppy. Or somebody did write it down, and then it was taken and destroyed somewhere. Officer J.M. Poe, who investigated the scene of the crime, had marked 2 spent shell cases with his initials at the scene while Detective Pete Barnes was present. When the Warren Commission asked J.M. Poe to identify the shells, none of his initials were on the 3 shell cases that they presented. Now, how is it possible that at the beginning there were 2 shell cases, and then mysteriously there were 3? Where'd that 3rd shell come from? Well, apparently this is the story that we are supposed to believe. The detective finds 2 shell cases laying on the floor, picks them up, puts them in an evidence bag, secures them. And then, for some mysterious reason, he picks up the 3rd shell case and pops it into his pocket. Several days later, when the Secret Service was trying to find the 3rd shell case, the detective suddenly realizes, oh, I've got it in my pocket. Now, this is a murder investigation. You don't do that kind of sloppy work during a murder investigation. But apparently when the President of the United States gets shot, it's acceptable to just do whatever you felt like. The reason they had to find that third shell case is also a bit of a mystery. Also, the murder weapon itself suddenly transformed from one weapon to another. The early report of authorities, November 22, 1963, said that the weapon used to assassinate President Kennedy was a 7.65 German Mauser bolt-action rifle. Rifle had been found by Dallas police on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade, passed on this bit of information to the press, and it was disseminated throughout the United States. Even Walter Cronkite had said the murder weapon was a Mauser. Suddenly, this well-made, highly accurate German weapon transforms into a 6.5 Italian Mannlicher Carcano bolt-action rifle that even the Italians will tell you is a piece of junk. Now, how is it that it went from being a Mauser to being a Mannlicher Carcano in the course of one day? Just another mystery in the assassination of John Kennedy. The experts from the U.S. Army and the FBI who were slated with testing this rifle discovered it was actually not usable in the original state that they found it. They had to insert shims along the telescopic sight before the rifle could be aimed. Then, even after the telescopic sight had been repaired, it proved unreliable. The condition of both the bolt and the trigger pull meant the rifle could not be aimed accurately. Now, the Mauser, very reliable, very well-made weapon. Mannlicher Carcano, not so much. You'd be better off using a Red Ryder BB gun. Dr. Bob Artwall, who referred to the Kennedy's skull as having been hit by a high-velocity bullet in an article in the Journal of American Medicine. A Mauser is a high-velocity rifle. The FBI's renowned firearms expert Robert Frazier told the Warren Commission the alleged murder weapon, the Mannlicher Carcano, had a very low muzzle velocity. Now, Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby is the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald. We know this pretty much for a fact. It was recorded on TV. People all throughout the United States and other parts of the world actually got to watch as Ruby walked up, shoves a gun into Oswald's stomach, and pulls the trigger. Why did he do this? The official story is that Jack Ruby wanted to save Jackie Kennedy from having to go through the trial if Oswald was arrested and tried. That sounds rather pathetic to just about everybody. There's an FBI document from 1947. It recommends that one Jack Rubenstein of Chicago should not be called to testify for the Committee of Un-American Activities because he is working for Congressman Richard Nixon. According to the Warren Commission, Ruby had no connection with Oswald, organized crime, or the government. Jack Ruby, a.k.a. Jacob Rubenstein, worked for both the CIA and the Mafia. He was involved in running guns to Cuba. The gun that he shot Lee Harvey Oswald with was one of 3 pistols that had been purchased for the sole purpose of shipping into Cuba so someone could assassinate Castro with one of them. Ruby had interests in several casinos that had been seized by Castro. He also, through his gun smuggling operations, managed to get Traficante out of Cuban prison. The Traficante was one of the mob bosses who had been running several of the casinos in Cuba at the time of the revolution. After killing Lee Harvey Oswald, Ruby said, "Everything pertaining to what happened has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred or my motives. The people that had so much to gain and had so much an interior motive for putting me in the position I'm in will never let the true facts come about or above board to the world." Ruby said all this on film after he had shot Oswald. Another statement that Ruby had made, also to a reporter, Ruby said, "When I mentioned about Adelaide Stevens, if he had been the vice president, there would never have been an assassination of our beloved President Kennedy." Well, the answer is the man in office now. He was referring to Johnson. Ruby said this in 1963 as well. Ruby was quite a talker. Might not have been the most literate man on the planet, but he still had a lot to say. Another statement Ruby had made, and this was to the Warren Commission. He said, "Gentlemen, I want to tell the truth, but I can't tell it here. If you want a fair shake out of me, you have to take me to Washington." At this time, Jack Ruby had pretty much confessed to killing Lee Harvey Oswald and was being held in prison in Texas. He had told the Warren Commission that as long as he was in Texas, he couldn't testify because his life was at stake. Only if they would take him out of the Texas prison, ship him to Washington, would he be feeling safe enough to tell them the deep, dark secrets that he knew. A short time later, Jack Ruby claimed that the government had injected him with cancer. He died shortly thereafter. Remember the story about Dr. Mary, who was trying to weaponize cancer cells? Perhaps that's how they took Jack Ruby out. Could Ruby have been sent to silent Oswald, given a choice? Kill him or we will kill you. Which is better, life in prison or being dead? Another possibility, super rich, powerful oilmen who wanted JFK killed. Now, why would oilmen want to take out the President of the United States? Well, it all comes down to money. Before Kennedy was assassinated, he had upset a lot of people. Two of those people were Clint Murchison and Harold Hunt. He talked about a plan, Kennedy did, to submit to Congress a tax reform plan designed to produce about $185 million in additional revenue by changing the favorable tax treatment that had been given to the oil company. Kennedy was particularly upset that Hunt, who had an annual income of about $30 million, paid only a very small amount of federal income tax. In his book JFK, The Second Plot, 1992, Matthew Smith points out that the oil industry in Texas had enjoyed huge tax concessions since 1926, when Congress had provided them as an incentive to increase much-needed prospecting. The oil depletion benefits were somehow left in place to become a permanent means by which immense fortunes were amassed by those in the industry. And well aware of the anomaly, John Kennedy had declared an intention to review the oil industry revenues. There was nothing in the world which would have inflamed the oil barons more than the president interfering with the oil depletion allowance. Yes, Kennedy was rocking the boat when it came to the oil barons. Now, the Secret Service. There has been several claims made that one or more of the Secret Service agents may have killed Kennedy. One was that the driver of the limousine turned around and shot him, even though Governor Conley and Governor Conley's wife and Jackie Kennedy didn't see this happen, along with the cameraman, Zapruder. But that was one of the claims made. Another claim was that a Secret Service agent riding in the car behind Kennedy got excited and accidentally shot Kennedy in the head with a rifle. People have lots of theories, and some of them are a little weird. Many of the Secret Service agents had spent the night, November 21st, drinking at a bar called The Cellar. The Cellar was owned by a mob member who was friends with, of all people, Jack Ruby. When the first shot is fired, if you watch the Zapruder film, you'll see that the limousine actually stops, and the driver turns and looks over his shoulder at Kennedy to see what's going on. This doesn't sound like the kind of thing you want to do when somebody's shooting at you. If shots are fired, you want to hit the gas and get out of there. But no, this highly trained, slightly inebriated Secret Service agent stops the limousine and turns to look at the president. Okay, so he screwed up. Shortly thereafter, they managed to get the car going. Agent Hill was the only Secret Service member who actually did anything in a positive manner. All the other agents are seen standing there looking around as if they wish that hangover would go somewhere else. Now, Agent Hill goes running forward, and he jumps up on the trunk of the limousine. That's when you see Jackie Kennedy climb out on the trunk, and the report was that she got on the trunk of the car to help Agent Hill into the limousine. That is not what Jackie Kennedy said. Jackie Kennedy said she clomb onto the trunk of the limousine to rescue a large chunk of John Kennedy's skull that had popped off the top of his head and was laying on the trunk. She thought that maybe the doctors could put it back in place and her husband would survive. Remember what they said in the movie, back and to the left. We're going to take a few-minute break here for station identification and a few brief commercial messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Are you craving a great cup of coffee? Stop on by the Organic Man Coffee Shop, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. It's their new location. They used to be on Lincoln Street, now they're on Iturbide. Stop on by and have the best coffee on the planet. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
Though we gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio.
I promise you this. I'll
Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
every day in a letter, sealed with a kiss.
You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Welcome back to the show. And like I said, remember in the movie JFK, back and to the left. If Kennedy had been shot in the head from the school book depository, he should have gone forward up against the seat that Governor Connally was sitting in. Instead, he goes sideways towards Jackie Kennedy and backwards towards the trunk. That's where the top of his head winds up. Anyone that's ever fired a rifle and seen the damage that it does, rifle bullets make very small entrance wounds, very large exit wounds. And yet, the Warren Commission wants us to believe that the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head created this enormous entrance wound and then made a little tiny exit wound as it came out through his temple. Now, how many bullets were fired at Dealey Plaza that day? At first, the report said there were 2 shots fired because they found 2 shell cases on the 6th floor of the school depository. Well, then a man came forward who had gotten hit in the cheek with a bullet. Since the bullet wound was obvious and there was no denying that 3 bullets had been shot, suddenly everybody was scrambling trying to find that 3rd shell case. That's when the detective discovered he'd accidentally put it in his pocket. Well, then spectators pointed out a hole in the dirt, in the grass on the Dealey Plaza, where they suspected there was a bullet also. So a sheriff's deputy got down on his knees with a knife, and he dug around in the ground until they believe he pulled a bullet out of the ground. A Secret Service agent walked up and identified himself to the deputy, took the bullet, placed it in his pocket, and left. Now, the Secret Service claims that there were no agents on the ground in Dealey Plaza. They said all their manpower was either driving Kennedy's limousine or riding in the follow-on cars. None of their personnel were out on foot. Yet dozens of witnesses have said that a man would come up to them, identify himself as a Secret Service agent, take whatever evidence that they had, and then remove it from the scene. Many witnesses said this, and yet the Secret Service still claims it couldn't have happened. The president had been shot, so what did they do? Finally, when the Secret Service woke up from their stupor, they rushed him to Parkland Hospital. Good idea. Your president has been shot. Let's take him to the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, Governor Connally is wheeled in one stretcher, and John Kennedy is wheeled in another stretcher. Dr. Red Duke was there. He was sent over to work on Governor Connally since he was not a neurosurgeon. They picked up Connally off the stretcher and placed him in the emergency room, and a bullet fell out. The bullet, not just any bullet. This is the bullet that they refer to as the magic bullet. According to the Warren Commission, this is the bullet that passed through Kennedy's back, came out through his throat, went through Governor Connally's chest, hit the dashboard, bounced off the dashboard, and went back into Governor Connally. Thus the term magic bullet. They claim that the bullet had exited through Kennedy's throat. So entered the back, went out through the throat. They're trying desperately to account for 3 bullets and not any more. And how many times have you heard of a bullet just falling out of someone? It doesn't happen all that often. The bullet looked as if it had been fired into something soft like water, not like it had just gone through 3 men bounced off a dashboard. And then for it to simply fall out? The Secret Service has no authority to investigate a murder. At that time, it didn't matter who you were. If you were murdered, it was the duty of whichever police agency was in the state to investigate. So the Dallas police began investigating the murder of Kennedy. However, for some mysterious reason that nobody can explain, the Secret Service decide that it's their duty to remove the body of Kennedy from Dallas. They went so far as to draw their guns and threaten people if they didn't allow them to remove evidence of a murder from Dallas. Now, why would they do that? Was it that they didn't think that the police of Dallas were smart enough to find out what had happened to Kennedy? Or could it have been they were afraid that the people of Dallas were too smart? And they would have looked at Kennedy's body and said, this man was shot from the front, not the back. However, guns were drawn, voices were raised, threats were made, and John Kennedy's body was removed from Parkland Hospital. Someone high up in the Secret Service must have made that call. Johnson, who was waiting on Air Force One, decides he's not leaving Dallas until he's been sworn in as the new president of the United States. Jackie Kennedy wanted to stay with John Kennedy in the back of the plane. She was sitting next to his coffin. They had placed Kennedy's body in a very nice, very expensive bronze coffin. Jackie Kennedy is sitting there with her dead husband. Johnson decides he's not going to be sworn in unless Jackie Kennedy is there to see it done. Can you imagine this one? I don't care if your husband's dead or not. You get your butt in here and watch me get sworn in as president. Something like, I'm sure Johnson didn't exactly say that, but it does sound a bit malicious on his part. Jackie Kennedy is escorted to the front of the plane. Johnson gets sworn in. John Kennedy's body is sitting in the back of the plane with no one keeping an eye on it. Kennedy had been declared dead at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. His body was wrapped in a sheet. The sheet was placed in an extremely expensive, heavy, ornate casket. The casket was placed on Air Force One. A few hours later, the plane lands at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, D.C. The casket was removed from the plane and placed in an automobile in which the deceased president's wife, Jacqueline, was riding. So she is still staying with her husband's body. A waiting team of soldiers carried a cheap shipping casket with the president's body in it into the morgue at 6:35 p.m. Even while Mrs. Kennedy was still slowly traveling from Andrews Air Force Base to Bethesda Medical Facility. How do we know this? It was witnessed by several Navy and Marine enlisted men who were there and saw it happen. A document by the funeral home says, body removed from metal shipping casket at Bethesda. Second document was an official military report filed 4 days after the assassination by Marine Sergeant Roger Behan. At approximately 18:35, that's 6:35 p.m., the casket was received at the morgue entrance and taken inside. The president's body was later officially carried into Bethesda morgue at 8 o'clock p.m. inside the expensive, heavy, ornate casket into which the body had originally been placed. Surprisingly, somehow Kennedy had gone from being wrapped in a sheet to being placed inside a body bag. Now, when could any of this have possibly happened? Perhaps when Johnson was being sworn in, since Jackie Kennedy had been practically physically removed from the back of the plane. This just gets stranger by the minute. The doctors who performed the autopsy on the President of the United States. Now, if you're going to be looking into the death of the President of our country, don't you say, let's get the best men on the planet in here? The two doctors that performed the autopsy, neither of them had ever performed an autopsy on a gunshot victim in their lives. During the autopsy, one of the doctors was examining the bullet wound to Kennedy's back. Now remember, Kennedy was shot in the back. The bullet came out through his throat. The doctor inserts his finger into the bullet hole, and he finds a bullet. The Mannlicher Carcano rifle, being a small velocity rifle, perhaps the bullet had entered Kennedy's back and hadn't gone all the way through. So now we have another bullet to contend with. How many bullets do we have? Okay, we've got the magic bullet that hit the governor, the one that passed through Kennedy, supposedly, bounced off the dashboard. Then we have the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head. That's 2. Then there's the bullet that hit Tague, the man standing by the overpass. That makes 3. There's the bullet that was pulled from the grass there at Dealey Plaza, taken away by the fake Secret Service agent. That makes 4. And now we have this 5th bullet removed from Kennedy's back. Now, we've got 5 bullets that were supposedly fired from a Mannlicher Carcano rifle that could barely be fired to begin with. And they don't have 5 shell cases to go with it. They still only have 3. Now, whatever happened to that fancy casket that they brought from Dallas? Secret Service agent Hill, the man that clumb on the trunk of the car, had contacted a funeral home, the O'Neill Funeral Home, and requested a casket for the president. The O'Neill Company sent them their best casket. 1964, O'Neill visited Washington, D.C. He went there with the sole purpose of trying to collect his bill for that coffin. They had never paid for it. February 1966, 3 80-pound bags of sand were placed in the casket. Then 42 half-inch holes were drilled into the casket. It was placed in the back of a C-130 military cargo plane, flown out over the ocean, and dropped into about 9,000 feet of water. Why would they do that with what could possibly have been a piece of evidence in the murder of Kennedy? Well, for some mysterious reason, they thought it would be a good idea to get rid of more evidence. Of the 121 witnesses at Dealey Plaza, approximately 51 of them claimed that the shots had come from the grassy knoll. Only 32 people said that they thought the shots had come from the book depository. The big question that you should ask yourself is who would really gain the most from Kennedy dying? Kennedy didn't like Johnson. In fact, he had planned to replace him before the next election. It seems Johnson's name had come up on a lot of illegal activity, including a murder investigation. Investigators scouring the scene of the shooting, the 6th floor of the school book depository, had found one partial fingerprint, and that was all that they had to lift. The print, as it turned out, belonged to Malcolm Wallace, the longtime friend of President Johnson. Malcolm Wallace was born and educated in Texas. He was an intelligent man who graduated from the University of Texas and was quickly recruited by Johnson and given a job as the Federal Department of Agriculture. He was also known for fooling around with other men's wives. He was later arrested and convicted for the murder of another man. So now we've got this homicide that's tied to Johnson. It wasn't looking too good for the vice president at the time. Johnson should never have actually been in the Senate to begin with. 1948, Coke Stevenson and Johnson were running in the Democratic primary election for the U.S. Senate. 5 days after the election, Stevenson appeared to be winning. He had a 112-vote lead. Then, surprisingly out of nowhere, county officials in Jim Wells County showed up with Box 13. Box 13 contained 200 votes, all for Johnson. And the weird thing is, rumor has it, all 200 people had voted in alphabetical order. When an investigation was later launched to find out if this was true or not, the courthouse burst into flames, taking with it all the evidence. Later, a man named George Parr was arrested and indicted on 650 counts. Somehow he managed to get off on all these counts, but it did look as if he had been doing some less than honorable dealings. Due to the unsurmountable pile of information that I have found while researching this story about JFK and the assassination, I've decided that it would be best to make a second show. So if you'll tune in July 16th, we'll be talking more about the JFK assassination and Lee Harvey Oswald. I hope you have enjoyed today's show. Tune in next week. We'll be talking to you again later.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man the same murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?